Hello, Manny Beal here, and welcome to part 12 of my deconstruction of UPB. And before we head further down through the text of the book, I want to add a few comments to my recent part 11, where I deconstructed the first syllogism of the 5 proofs. And there was a thing that I just have to, there's a window that's open here. Excuse me about that. I need to close that one, otherwise it will be freezing cold. Where was I? Yes, a little thing. I sometimes that feeling when you are talking about something and there's something you should say. There's something you told yourself you should remember to say, and you keep in the back of your head trying to remind yourself what was it. And I couldn't figure it out last time. Now I remember what it was, and it's another critique of his structure of the first syllogism, which is obvious, basically, if you have seen my presentation, that the major premise contains a concept that has an attribute, and then the minor premise has an impression in the now, so to say, that equals a concept. And then the conclusion is that impression has that concept referred to in the major premise. So there's sort of a content of the steps in the syllogism that needs to conform to that. That concept that has an attribute, impression that has equals a concept, impression has an attribute. So if we look at this simplified version of his statement that UPB must be valid, concept has an attribute. Well, UPB is not a concept. This conflation of what is concept, what it entails being a concept, is something that is floating also in Stefan Molyneux' book here. And what I'm referring to is something that can be an object, like a cow, bicycle, fence, planet, something that has that can have an attribute being, qualia, sense data, red, sweet, smooth, smell of roses, whatever, right? So UPB is a methodology of some kind. It's not a concept, right? So he can't even use a syllogism for this. And even if he used a syllogism, it wouldn't be a proof, which he claims it is, right? So UPB must be valid. Valid is not an attribute of anything. It can be sort of an attribute of a method, maybe, but it's certainly not an attribute of a concept, because UPB is not a concept. So then he says in the second premise, that's the minor premise, then he should have something else than UPB, but then he's referring to the same concept, right? He's not having an impression of a concept. Now he's using UPB again, talking about the same validity. So he's sort of repeating himself in the second minor premise, which is incorrect according to syllogisms. So it's not only wrong, it's on another planet, sort of say, right? So, and the last one must be something like impression. Your impression, the object you're referring to, has that certain attribute, because all those representation of that concept usually have that, is considered to also have that attribute, even if you don't mention it, but as you identify the impression that equals that concept, that impression must also have that attribute. But here he is not combining, because premise 1 and 2 are incorrect. He can't deduce anything in the conclusion, even if it was internally correct, which I don't think it is. So everything that can possibly be wrong with this proof is wrong. It's I mean, it's so bad that I even lack, an expression to state without going into some sort of hyperbole how bad this kind of philosophy is. Right? It's really, really, really bad. Okay, let's head into UPB and see what it says. UPB, optional and objective. Since we have proven, yes, of course, it's not we have proven. You think you have proven, right? Stop saying we. Talk about yourself. Take responsibility. Weakling. Proven the validity of universally preferable behavior. The question of morality now shifts. Oh, since morality is valid, well, it isn't. Not his morality, at least. What theories can quantify, classify, explain, and predict it? First of all, we must remember that morality is clearly optional. Every man is subject to gravity and requires food to live, but no man has to act morally. If I rape, steal, or kill, no thunderbolt strikes me down. Moral rules like the scientific method or biological classifications are merely ways of rationally organizing facts and principles relative to objective reality. The fact that compliance with moral rules is optional, however, has confused many thinkers into believing that morality itself is subjective. Nothing could be further from the truth. The truth, you need truth in order to establish objectivity. Objectivity can't be true, right? Objectivity is derived on an agreement on truth. Okay. Living organisms are part of material reality, and material reality is rational and objective. What? Rational is something that human beings are. Human beings are rational. Material reality. So you think that a rock outside my window is rational? What? And objective? There's nothing that is intrinsically objective. It's not like you can say that rock over there is objective, but that rock is subjective. Or are you saying that rocks can be objective, but horses can only be subjective? Or what are you saying? Why is one experience of mine per definition objective, while other things I can experience are subjective? So what's the difference? Applying moral theories is optional, but that does not mean that all moral theories are subjective. The scientific method is also optional, but it is not subjective. Applying biological classifications is optional, but biology is not subjective. No, but they are not objects or subjects, right? Biology is a method. It's a description. Choices are optional, consequences are not. I can choose not to eat, but I cannot choose to live without eating. I can choose to behead someone, but I cannot choose whether or not they can live without a head. Why are we going into these annoying examples? You have just proven the holy grail of philosophy. It's like, oh, done. Let me go into some more circle jerk. Why are we not applying this morality? Why? What do we need this optional and objective? But why do we need it? I don't understand. Now, since morality is a valid concept, the next question is, to what degree or extent is morality valid? Is this a typo or now, since morality is a valid concept. The next question is, to what degree or extent is morality valid? So you're saying it's a valid concept, but there's only to some extent that it is valid. That I have a notion that you might be onto something, but I'm really not sure what you mean, because you're using the same term. It's a valid concept, and morality is valid. But if you call morality a concept, then morality is valid. But so why are you asking to what extent it is valid? As mentioned above, the first test of any scientific theory is universality. Yes, of course, because that's in your title. Just as a theory of physics must apply to all matter, a moral theory that claims to describe the preferable actions of mankind must apply to all mankind. Well, a theory of physics must not apply to all matter, but you go about your day, and if you experience some matter that behaves in a way that is not according to a theory, well, then you must adjust the theory, right? The theory doesn't apply to matter. Matter applies to the theory, so to say, right? Okay. No moral theory can be valid if it argues, but a theory cannot argue that a certain action is right in Syria, but wrong in San Francisco. No, but no, you're talking about actions. You're talking. You have proved that it's behavior that is valid, right? I mean, if we are pretending that you have proven that, now you're talking about actions. Don't start to talk about actions when you have proven that it's only behaviors that are valid, right? Now you're cheating. Is right in Syria, but wrong in San Francisco. I cannot pay that person A must do X, but person B must never do X. I cannot say that what was wrong yesterday is right today, or vice versa. If it does, it is false, and must be refined or discarded. To be valid, any moral theory must also pass the criterion of logical consistency, since the behavior of matter is logical, consistent, and predictable. But, have you heard of the uncertainty principle? So nothing is exactly predictable, right? I'm not trying to be, you can always find some, theory somewhere that goes against, common sense and sort of, but this logical, consistent, and predictable, right? Logic is something human beings do, right? Consistency is a description by human being. Predictable is a description by human beings. It's not something that matter is. It's an interpretation, right? And it's a prediction, predictable. Yeah, you can predict something, but that doesn't mean that matter is predictable, right? Human beings predict what matter does, but that doesn't mean that the predictability is a part of matter, right? All theories involving matter, either inorganic or organic, must also be logical, consistent, and predictable. The theory of relativity cannot argue that the speed of light is both constant and not constant at the same time, or that it is 186,000 miles per second, 5 fathoms in depth, and also green in color. No. However, since moral theories apply to mankind, and mankind is organic, the degree of empirical consistency required for moral theories is less than that required for inorganic theories. Okay. All rocks, for instance, must fall down, but not all. Down is a relative term. Okay. If you're standing on the head, it's falling up. It's a relative term. Okay. But not all horses have to be born with only one head. Biology includes 3 forms of randomness, which are environment, genetic mutation, and free will. For example, poodles are generally friendly, but if beaten for years, they will likely become aggressive. Horses are defined as having only one head, but occasionally a 2-headed mutant is born. Similar, human beings generally prefer eating to starving, except anorexics. These exceptions do not bring down the entire science of biology. Thus, since moral theories describe mankind, they cannot be subject to exactly the same requirements for consistency as theories describing inorganic matter. The final test that any moral theory must pass is the criterion of empirical observation. For instance, a moral theory must explain the universal prevalence of moral beliefs among mankind, as well as the divergent results of human moral experiments such as fascism, communism, socialism, and cannibalism. It must also explain the basic fact about human society, such as the fact that state power always increases, or that propaganda tends to increase as state power increases. If it fails to explain the past, understand the present, and predict the future, then it must be rejected or invalid. No. Well, maybe to some extent, but you can't use a time period where said moral principle was not applied and describe what is wrong, but you can sort of theorize how things would have been if it had been applied, and sort of say then people would have chosen to do this, that, the other, and the third, and say then these actions over here wouldn't have happened. So far, I'm willing to go, but there's a danger of, and it's actually a good point, I would say. It's a good point to have in mind that, and reminds me of something that usually is used as a critique of a moral principle. And when you, if you say, well, this moral principle I think is good, then people would use something that happened in the recent past and say, but how would it solve that problem? Well, the problem is actually that problem wouldn't have been there if the moral principle have been applied. So if that's sort of what you're going for, I completely agree. UPB, the practice. How does all this look in practice? Let's look at how the requirement for universality affects moral theories. We shall touch here on proofs and disproofs for specific moral propositions, which we shall examine more in detail in part 2. Okay, so now we are going to possibly, hopefully, get a definition of what a moral proposition. Now, I'm not crazy about that term, because a proposition is about an object, and morality is not an object. For universality affects moral theories. Okay, so a moral theory, what do you mean by a moral theory? Do you mean a moral principle of some kind, or do you mean that thing you are doing here? UPB is a moral theory. Is that? So these terms are sort of floating around, and it's freaking annoying, to be honest, right? It has to be more strict. Okay, we shall examine in more detail in part 2. So there's a part 2, okay. If I say that gravity affects matter, it must affect all matter. Yeah. Okay, I think I understand where you're going. If even one pebble proves immune to gravity, my theory is in trouble. If I propose a moral theory that argues that people should not murder, it must be applicable to all. But isn't that small pebble, is that not the edgelord of doom that come and say there's a pebble over there that seems to not... If I propose a moral theory that argues that people should not murder, it must be applicable to all people. Well, I would agree that it should be a moral principle should be compatible with any individual capable of acting or behaving or whatever the term is according to that principle, of course. If certain people, such as soldiers, are exempt from that rule, then I have to either prove that soldiers are not people or accept that my moral theory is false. I would agree. There is no other possibility. On the other hand, if I propose a moral theory that argues that all people should murder, then I have saved certain soldiers, but condemned to evil all those not currently murdering someone, including those being murdered, which is surely incorrect. If, to save the virtue of soldiers, I alter my theory to argue that it is moral for people to murder if someone else tells them to, a political leader say, then I must deal with the problem of universality. Okay, so that's what when you're saying universality. Okay, so there's no individual who can wield the moral principle who is exempt from what is in the moral principle. If politician A can order a soldier to murder an Iraqi, then the Iraqi must also be able to order the soldier to murder politician A, and the soldier can also order politician A to murder the Iraqi. The application of this theory results in a general and amoral paralysis, and thus is proven invalid. Well, I completely agree. I mean, this is equal for anyone. Yes, absolutely. I also cannot logically argue that it's wrong for some people to murder, but right for other people to murder, since all human beings share common physical properties and requirements. Proposing one rule for one person and the opposite rule for another is invalid. It is like proposing a physics theory that says that some rocks fall down while others fall up. Not only is it illogical, it contradicts an observable fact. The reality of it is that human beings are, as a species, share common characteristics, and so cannot be subjected to opposing rules. Biologists have no problems classifying certain organisms as human, because they share common and easily identified characteristics. It is only moralists who seem to find the level of consistency impossible. Possibly. Furthermore, if my moral theory proves that the same man should not murder one day but should murder the next day, say when he steps into the Iraqi desert, then my position is even more ludicrous. I want to point out that you can't observe murder, right? Murder is, again, it's defined one way or another as an immoral killing. And just labeling something as immoral is violating Hughes is-out gap. So murder is a term you should not use. You should avoid using that until you have proven how you get to murder in an objective fashion. That would be equivalent to arguing that one day a rock falls downward and the next day it falls upward. To call this any kind of consistent theory is to make madness sanity. Since valid theories require logical consistency, a moral theory cannot be valid if it is both true and false at the same time. A moral theory that approves of stealing, for instance, faces an insurmountable logical problem. No moral theory should, if it is universally applied, eliminate behavior it defines as moral while simultaneously creating behavior it defines as immoral. If everyone should steal, then no one will steal, which means that the moral theory can never be practiced. And why will no one steal? Well, because a man will only steal if he can keep the property he is stealing. He's not going to bother stealing a wallet if someone else is going to immediately steal the wallet from him. Any moral theory proposing that stealing is good, no, but it can't be. It's a contradiction. Stealing is bad. It is a part of the definition of the word stealing, right? Now you're manipulating words again. Stealing and murder and these moral terms should be avoided until you take some situation or some kind of action through UPB, and then the UPB will point out that's why it's a murder and that's why it's stealing, right? Because you are smuggling in morality. Stealing is also automatically invalid because it posits that property rights are both valid and invalid at the same time, and so fails the test of logical consistency. If I steal from you, I am saying that your property rights are invalid. However, I want to keep what I am stealing, and therefore I am saying that my property rights are valid. However, property rights cannot be both valid and invalid at the same time, so this proposition itself must be invalid. Similarly, any moral theory that advocates rape faces again, it's the same problem. I'm jumping to the next part. Thus, subjecting moral theories to the scientific method, well, you can't do that because scientific method is an inductive, and you've proven your moral theory by using deductive logic. So you can't combine scientific method and morality. Produces a result that conform to reality, rationality. Empirical observation of plain common sense. Murder, theft, arson, rape, and assault are all proven immoral. No, they are not. The content of the word has immorality to it, but they're just words. You can't use the word to add immorality. You have to point to it. You have to objectify it somehow, right? And point to an object and say, look, that aspect or that attribute on whatever it is you're pointing to, right? That proves that it's immoral. You can't just say, I could possibly observe murder and therefore this and that, right? You have to point to it and say, this is what makes it murder. That's the job of your theory, right? Okay, to avoid in swallowing this rather large conceptual pill, below is a table that helps equate theories of physics and biology with scientific theories of universally preferable or moral behavior. Okay, let's see what it is. Physics, biology, morality. Okay, subject, matter, biology, organic matter, preferable behavior for mankind. Instance, physics, a rock, biology, a horse, a man. So, okay, so a subject in physics is matter, subject in biology is organic matter, and subject in morality is preferable behavior of mankind, for mankind. I don't understand that. An instance is in physics a rock, in biology a horse, in morality a man. You mean a human. Sample rule, physics a gravity, biology the desire for survival, morality self-ownership. I mean, this is sort of, you're just slamming this table and then saying this is without explaining things. Self-ownership, this new term not mentioned before. Entropy is not explained. Organic is not explained. Maybe that's not necessary. Stealing is wrong. It's not explained. Common structures of atoms. Empirical verification, what is that? A mass does not attract mass. If communism succeeds relative to stated goal theories. I mean, it's something I have to pass this and you can look at it yourself. In conclusion, it is safe to say that A, moral rules are valid, and B, moral theories must be subjected to the rigors and logic of evidence. The rigors of logic and theories must be subjected to the rigors of logic and evidence, I suppose, just as theories of physics and biology are. Any moral theory based on non-universal or self-contradictory principle is demonstrably false. Okay. UPB, the framework. UPB can thus be seen as a framework for validating ethical theories or proposition, just as the scientific method is a framework that is used to validate scientific theories or propositions. An example of a moral proposition is the initiation of the use of force is wrong. But but it doesn't explain. Maybe I'm jumping too quickly here, but again, this is wrong, right? Yeah, it's a moral proposition, but you are not pointing out what the immorality is and the morality is. This is wrong, that is wrong, that's just a claim, right? UPB is the methodology that tests that proposition against both consistent empirical observation. But then you can't just say, if somebody says this is wrong, then I'll, throw it, stuff it through my UPB machine. It has to conform to some standard. And saying something is wrong is not a sufficient standard because you haven't explained the objectivity of that wrongness. You are so focused on this, scientific and objective and consistent. And why don't you explain what that wrongness is, right? UPB thus first asks, is the proposition logical and consistent? UPB then asks, what evidence exists for the truth of the proposition? Well, yeah, good question. To keep this book at a reasonable length. Okay, so now we have to cut things short. We will in general deal mostly with the first criterion of logical consistency. For the second criterion, we shall rely for evidence on the universal prohibitions across the cultures against certain actions, as the Rev said. You keep repeating these words as if it's objective. It isn't, right? It isn't. Much more could be written on the historical evidence that helps support or reject various moral propositions, but we shall leave that for another time. If we establish the validity of UPB, we have achieved an enormous amount. If we do not, evidence will scarcely help us. I'm not sure what he's trying to do here. Let us now turn to the question of whether the UPB framework deals with matters of ethics and aesthetics. In general, I mean, if there's going to be 50 pages about how to apply this principle, or this, it's not even a principle, this, you have to figure out some kind of moral statement, a moral proposition. Then you have to run it through 40 pages of UPB, and then you have to figure out what the conclusion might be, and then you can brush your teeth, right? And then you can drive your car. I mean, but it doesn't work. It has to be some sort of condensed, it must be condensed into a principle that is understandable and usable and functional and quick to use in your everyday life. Of course it must be. You can't do this, right? It can't work. It is universally preferable that the scientific method validate physical theories, but we cannot use force to inflict in scientific method on those who do not use it, since not using the scientific method is not a violent action. But why do you bring in violence? What is that? What does that to do with it? Define what you mean by violent. Define that. Non-violent actions, by their very nature, are avoidable. But a violent action, isn't that avoidable? If you want to hit me, I can try to avoid your hitting me, right? If a physicist stops using the scientific method, but instead starts consulting tarot cards, he is not violent in inflicting his choice on me, and I can avoid him. A rapist, on the other hand, is violent in inflicting his preferences upon his victim, or her victim, right? But yeah, but what is it about that situation or the objective things present in that situation that makes you able to say that that is rape? I'm not trying to, eliminate the idea of rape. I want to stress that very much. I'm absolutely against rape. What I want him to point out is how you identify it, so you know it. You have to be able to know it. Otherwise, you can't talk about it, right? Otherwise, it's just BS, right? Although we first focused on UPB in the realm of ethics, UPB can now be seen as an umbrella term, which includes such discipline as the scientific method, logic, empiricism, debating, language, ethics. Ethics is the subset of UPB which deal with inflicted behavior or the use of violence. Any theory that justifies or denies the use of violence is a moral theory. Denies it. Why? Where does that claim come from? I'm not saying it is necessarily incorrect. but you're just sort of making things up as you go. Ethics is a subset. No, ethics is philosophy. The philosophy you do, you make, you perform, you think to create UPB. Hopefully, right? I would challenge that idea, but ethics is a kind of thinking. It's not a subset of a system. What are you talking about? Let us look at 3 actions to help us further distinguish between ethics and aesthetics. But they don't need to be distinguished. They have nothing to do with each other. First action is irrationality. The second is lying. The third is murder. Why is that? I mean, oh my God. I feel like I really want to jump past this. I mean, I can't get my head together on this. I mean, the difference between these two is lying. Well, I don't care what you think about lying. If I want to lie, I'm going to lie, right? And you can't check whether or not I'm lying, right? I can check whether or not you are lying, right? Saying that you can sort of identify lying is bullshit. You can't, because it's a comparison between what you claim and what you experience. And there's other people's experience you have no access to, right? A reasonable moral theory should be able to explain why this is, murder, no, requirements for ethics. Let's take that one. Certain preconditions must exist or be accepted in order for ethical judgments or theories to have any validity. Clearly, choice and personal responsibility must both be accepted as axioms. But then state the axiom. Choice. Is choice an axiom? But if I think I have choice, I don't need to call it an axiom. An axiom must be more than choice or responsibility. Explain what responsibility is, the personal responsibility. Explain it, define it. If a rock comes bouncing down a hill or crashes into your car, we do not hold the rock morally responsible, since it has no consciousness, cannot choose, and therefore cannot possess personal responsibility. If the rock dislodged simply as a result of time and geology, then no one is responsible for the resulting harm to your car. If, however, you saw me push the rock out of its position, you would not blame the rock, but rather me. To add a further complication, if it turns out that I dislodged the rock because another man forced me to a gunpoint, you would be far more likely to blame the gun-toting initiator of the situation rather than me. As we have discussed above, entering into any debate requires an acceptance of the realities of choice, value, and personal responsibility. However, these factors are also present in the choice of the color of paint. Okay, there's a little point, right? There's little point in writing a book about personal preferences, and we can turn to Anne Landers for a discussion of socially preferable behavior. Here, then, we will focus on the possibility of universally preferable behavior. I don't know who that person is and why it's that Anne is mentioned. Choice. If I accept your invitation to a dinner party, but find the conversation highly offensive, I can decide to get up and leave, and I can also choose to never accept another invitation. This capacity for escape and or avoidance of it is an essential characteristic differentiating aesthetics from ethics. Okay. I don't think I agree with that. I think it's a false dichotomy. It's a category error and it's a false dichotomy. Avoidance. If you and I are both standing at the top of a cliff and I turn to you and say, stand in front of me so I can push you off the cliff, what would your response be? If you do voluntarily stand in front of me and I then push you off the cliff, this would more likely be considered a form of suicide on your part rather than murder on my part. I guess. But what things are considered is a different thing than what things are, okay? What you consider something is not objective, right? So now you're sort of wandering around in subjectivity now, and possibly wanting to at some point say, and now it becomes objective because I wanted to, right? Avoidance and initiation. There is a particular issue with avoidance that will come up later in the book, which is worth clearing up here beforehand. If I live on a high mountain 15 miles away from you and send you an email telling you that if you ever walk in front of my house, I'm going to shoot you, it is relatively easy for you to avoid this situation. My threat of force is certainly involved, but questions would surely be raised. What I wonder is that now he has proven his framework. Why does he have to explain all these things and situations, and people might think this and might think that? This should be for unless there's something I have missed completely. This is a discussion with himself he should have before he reaches his moral principle, because he is talking about moral sort of judgment. If the other thing that might be the case is that now he is just given himself carte blanche to, discuss with himself moral contents of things. If that's all his proof is about, his framework is that now I can, dabble along and discuss all sorts of situations in all sorts of people and bring in my own ideas about philosophy, as long as they are universal and preferable and behavior, then I don't give a flying F about it, because then it's not a principle you're talking about. You're not running a principle through it, right? It must be something short, concise, and precise that people can understand. They can't have 20, 30, 40 pages that you have to analyze. That is also very confusing and convoluted, and all sorts of concepts are brought in, or ideas or terms or whatever, to understand what you're going to do in a certain situation. You have to be able to act in the moment, right? This can't work. This cannot possibly work in any way that human beings function. For the moment, we can assume that any threat of the initiation of violence is immoral, but the question of avoidance, particularly the degree of avoidance and crime, is also important. In general, the more that a threat interferes with the normal course, I don't give a crap to be ethics, aesthetics, and avoidability. I'm going to jump past this. It is simply too much. Initiation. Let's take a stab at that. A reasonable moral theory should be able to explain all of the above universal standards, just as a reasonable theory of physics should be able to explain how a man can unconsciously calculate the arc of a thrown baseball and catch it. If the framework of UPB can explain the above, then it will certainly have passed at least the common sense test. What common sense test? Now you're bringing in some sort of common sense test you haven't discussed before, or at least I haven't. I've jumped past a few pieces of text, so now I can say that it hasn't been mentioned before, but that's the problem I will have then if I don't read everything, right? Common sense test? This does not mean that some surprising, even shocking conclusion may not result from our moral theory, but at least we shall have passed the first hurdle of explaining the obvious before analyzing that which is far from obvious. With that in mind, let us turn to the question of initiation. A surgeon can stab you with a scalpel, but we can easily understand that his action is very different from a mugger. What is a mugger? So you have you had sort of let's see, initiation. You had a category up here, right? You had a category up here somewhere. Let me see. An instance, a man. Okay? Morality, a man. I'm supposing that what you're referring to here, surgeon, is a man. So why are you calling it a surgeon? A mugger? Is it a man or a woman? Why do you call it a mugger? What's the difference? Now you're adding in some sort of subjective content to the interpretation of the being of that person. You can't do that. You're bringing in the art. It's again David Hume. He says you shouldn't do that. You should say a man can stab you with a scalpel, right? Is that different from a man who stabs you with a knife? Why is that different? Well, it isn't, but it sounds different because you're now using terms like surgeon and mugger, right? Where there's already some idea of a moral difference, but you have not yet pointed to the moral difference. What is the moral content of the one compared to the other? You should use that term, a man, that you stated in your table on the previous pages. So it's manipulation once again, right? This difference can be understood through further analysis of initiation. If you get cancer, you may ask a surgeon to operate on you. The reason that the surgeon stabbed is not immoral is that the cancer initiated an attack upon your life and health. No, it isn't. Because what if I haven't given that so-called surgeon, can that surgeon just say, I see that there's an attack on you, the cancer is attacking you, I'm going to stab you with a knife. And I say, no, get the fuck away from me, surgeon, right? Get the fuck away with your stabbing. He said, no, I'm moral, I must initiate. Get the fuck away, right? So it doesn't work. The mugger who stabs you, well, you have already labeled it as an immoral person. So it's by definition, it is immoral, but you haven't pointed to the immorality of it, right? If I'm a chronic and long-time smoker, I have participated in a chain of events that led to my lung cancer. By initiating and maintaining the habit of smoking, I have set in motion a chain of causality that can result in a life-threatening affliction. It is certainly possible for me to get lung cancer without smoking or smoke without getting lung cancer, but I certainly have affected the odds. No, smoking can't affect odds. It can't. There's no causality. And even if you believe in causality, there's no causality between lung cancer and odds. Similarly, it is possible for me to leave my wallet on a park bench for a week, return and find it still sitting there. But by leaving it there for such a long time, I certainly have affected the odds of being gone. What does that have to do with anything? I mean, come on. Oh, the non-aggression principle. Okay, so now we have what I presume is a moral principle. A moral rule is often proposed called the non-aggression principle, or NAP. It is also called being a porcupine pacifist, insofar as a porcupine only uses force in self-defense. The NAP is basically the proposition that the initiation of the use of force is morally wrong. Yeah, but it's not a proposition because it's not about an object. It must be some kind of definition or something, right? Or something else. Or to put it more in the terms of conversation, the non-initiation of force is universally preferable. But that some people claim that something is morally wrong doesn't point to the moral part of it, right? You're bringing in that ought, just like Hume says you can't do without explaining it, right? That when we analyze a principle such as the NAP, there are only 7 possibilities, 3 in the negative, 3 in the positive. The initiation of use of force is always morally wrong, sometimes morally wrong, never morally wrong, no moral content, never morally right, sometimes morally right, always morally right. Would you mind explaining what morally wrong is? Right? No, you're just dragging this morality around and sticking it in wherever you want without explaining what it is and how you have an objective access to it, right? As we have seen above, however, UPB as an all or nothing framework. If an action is universally preferable, then it cannot be limited by individual geography, time, etc. If it is wrong to murder in the Algiers, then it is also wrong to murder in Belgium. Now, I might want to, the non-aggression principle. Okay, let's say there's a non-initiation of force is morally wrong. Okay, let's say that has been proven. Then why do you need to create all these? It's always morally wrong. It's sometimes morally. This, you can't stand somewhere in a situation figuring out and then, may take some situation and divide it up in 7 parts and, whatever. I mean, what if I made my own moral principle? Do I also need to sift it through these 7? It could be always morally wrong, sometimes morally wrong. What is always or sometimes morally wrong? If it's sometimes morally wrong, is that the situation now? I mean, I'm in the now. Is now a part of sometimes? Well, it's if it is wrong to murder in Algiers, then it's also wrong to murder in Belgium, the United States, and North Pole, and on the moon. If it is wrong to murder yesterday, then it cannot be right to murder tomorrow. If it is wrong for Bob to murder, then it must also be wrong for Doc to murder. Yes, I will go with that, but you still haven't explained the wrongness or the odd part. Uniting the NAP with UPB thus allows us to whittle these 7 statements down to 3. It is universally preferable to initiate the use of force. It is universally preferable to not initiate use of force. The initiation of use of force is not subject to universal preference. This is the natural result of applying the requirement of rational consistency to ethical proposition. A rational theory cannot validly propose that opposite results can occur from the same circumstances. A scientific theory cannot argue that one rock must fall down, but another rock must fall up. Einstein did not argue that EMC squared on a Thursday, but that EMC cubed on a Friday or on Mars or during the blue moon. The law of conservation, that matter can be neither created nor destroyed, does not hold true when you really, really want it to, or if you pay a guy to make it so. Well, you really, really wanted your syllogism or UPB must be valid. You really, really wanted UPB to be valid, and therefore you decided, well, I'm just going to decide that it's valid, right? Let's see. This consistency must be required as system of ethics and UPB, but you should not talk about what should be required by a system of ethics. You have just created one. Right? You are past that now. Unless there's something I have really missed, you have proven, according to yourself at least, right, that UPB is right, correct. So why are you talking about what criteria there are for, requirements for a system of ethics? Because that should be on the other side of that proof of UPB. And we still subject generally accepted moral theories to this rigor in part of a few pages. However, since we are dealing with the question of consistency, it is well worth taking the time to deal with our capacity for inconsistency. The fact that UPB only validates logically consistent moral theories does not mean that there can be no conceivable circumstance under which we may choose to act against the tenets of such a theory. It would have been nice if you had made sort of a short list and saying, okay, you are proposing some text or some statement as a moral theory or moral proposition that use that because you use that term. Okay, then you should say, okay, you should have sort of an algorithm or something for, applying UPB. So sort of a point one, do this, check this. Point two, check this, do this, check this, check this. And then if everything is done, it checks out. You can use it, right? Why all this, lifeboat scenarios and all sorts of gray areas and what shades of gray and universality and exceptions, and I reject I refuse to use this. Simply, I won't use this. I simply won't use this. I reject this as the beast, of course. An objective review of human history would seem to point to the grim reality that by far the most dangerous thing is what is a false ethical system. Well, I would agree. Okay, so now we are history lesson, propaganda. See, I can't sit here and read aloud. So, okay. Part 2 application. Okay. Maybe I was judging too fast. Ethical categories. We can now turn to an examination of how UPB validates or invalidates our most common moral propositions. If our most common moral propositions and can catch a baseball, we at least pass the first and most important struggle. Okay, the 7 categories, as mentioned above, propositions regarding universal preferable behavior fall into 3 general categories: positive, negative, and neutral. To help us separate aesthetics from ethics, let us start by widening these categories to encompass any behavior that can be subjected to an ethical analysis. These 7 categories are: it is good, it is aesthetically positive, it is personally positive, it is neutral, it is personally negative, it is aesthetically negative, it is evil. It is so these are attributes of things that exist. Or is it, I mean, the terms and the ideas of subjectivity, objectivity, and methods and science and everything is now one big total scramble in my head, right? Or at least if I hadn't done any sort of, let's say, philosophy before now, or only very little, I would be absolutely and completely confused about this. There would possibly be something here and there I would say, that sounds, but trying to really understand it, right? It's like the more you try to understand this, the less you understand, right? The less is you understand about it, because then you are finding all these contradictions and terms that are used in different ways or are just pulled in on page 64 without being used before, or whatever it is, right? So I mean, virtue. Now we're talking about virtue all of a sudden. I think it has been mentioned before. What is the first test rate? So I'm going to have to leave you now. The coma test, capacity. I mean, this with all the things that I pointed out about this theory so far. Okay, all the things that I pointed out so far, and the central proof for its validity is absolutely ridiculous. Okay, what I've written here, right, about syllogisms and his proofs and so on, and all the shortcomings of his philosophy, it would be ridiculous. Actually, I would actually feel like I'm being an idiot for showing this kind of philosophy some respect, right? sitting here going, meticulously through the next, 80 pages or 50 pages or whatever, analyzing this would be me looking like a freaking idiot. And I don't want to look like an idiot, right? I think I rest my case, right? I rest my case here. I can't go on anymore. My mind will explode if I have to go any further, right? Let's aesthetically positive. Personally positive. Morally neutral, personally negative, aesthetically negative. All these categories, I simply can't hold it all in my head. I can't work with this view, the second test, murder, and then no property. No, I'm sorry, I simply cannot go through this, because if he makes a framework of how to apply, or framework that is about how to apply morality, let's say, to some statement that potentially could be a moral principle of a kind, and he needs like 80 pages to explain how you do it. I mean, it's like you have to read a freaking book every time you need to ride your bicycle, right? It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. I know that if you have a moral principle and you could spend 40 pages going through, so channeling that moral statement through UPB, and when if it checks out on the other side, well, then you can go out and use it. But what does that matter if the other guys I'm in clinch with have another principle, right? And what if those principles contradict each other in some way? Would that disprove UPB? Can you just make up your own principle and then go out in the world and say, no, I have this principle that this North American unbearded dude, right? He said it's okay, it checks out, so I can do this. Isn't principles or morals isn't it about everybody has to adhere to that principle? Otherwise, they can't figure out how to work together if they had different principles, right? You see, so if they have to work together on the principle, but why shouldn't it be sort of a universal principle? So if it works everywhere and it's universal and all that, why not go the whole 9 yards and create the freaking moral principle? Why are you going 90% of the way and then saying, now you have to figure out a principle and check it out with my UPB? Why don't you go all the way? It's ridiculous, right? You need to find a moral principle that people can work from, and that sort of checks out by, going metaphysics, epistemology, and describing the whole 9 yards, right? This doesn't work. It can never work. It's ridiculously bad argued. The central proofs do not work. They don't check out. They are simply ridiculous. It takes sort of 40 pages of prose to check whether or not your principle works or not. And everybody in the world can have a couple of principles and everybody's happy then, right? I don't buy it, okay? I simply do not buy this. Okay, so I think this is the end of my torturous deconstruction of UPB. I hope you enjoyed it. Please share and like and subscribe, whatever. Tell everybody about how ridiculous UPB is, and it might help them if they see my deconstruction here. So thank you for listening in. Can you have a nice time? See you in another video at another point in time, maybe a new construction on something else. Let's see how it goes.